Okay, looks like we're live. What's going on, everybody? So I'm joined with Jack Angstreich. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yeah, close. Angstreich, I usually say.
Okay, Angstreich. Okay. So, Jack is a pretty amazing debater. From what I understand, you have a bit of a philosophy background.
Well, not formally, strictly speaking, but yeah, I've been studying it for a long time. I mean, I have been sort of sitting in on classes, but I don't actually have any, like, credits in philosophy.
Okay, sure. Well, anyway, I saw a debate that Jack was in just a few days ago where you were debating some Christians on the problem of evil, and I thought you had some interesting arguments with regards to that. So I brought you on here just to go through your sort of debate tactics with the problem of evil, and you're going to point out different methods of using the problem of evil.
Yeah, okay. Well, so it sounded like the argument that you had heard was probably the logical problem from evil. There's also an evidential problem from evil. I think both are very strong, very, very powerful. What could be called atheological arguments, atheistic arguments. Um, so the logical problem of evil is an argument to that sets out to show that there's that evil is incompatible with the existence of God, logically incompatible. Whereas the evidential argument is kind of like a probabilistic argument. The idea is kind of like uh, that the amount of evil that we see is just seems to be uh, incredibly unexpected on the God hypothesis, and therefore counts as strong disconfirmation of that hypothesis. Um, so the evidential problem grants that the existence of some evil might be compatible with the existence of God, whereas the logical problem of evil is saying that any evil at all is inconsistent with God's existence. That argument is generally taken to be weaker because there's a higher sort of burden to meet, which is to show like a basic logical incompatibility. And in fact, in philosophy of religion, I think there's a widespread view. It's certainly something you hear very often from apologists and some philosophers that that argument has been defeated. Um, that there isn't really, well, usually it's attributed to Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. Um, that Alvin Plantinga basically defeated the logical problem of evil. And so it's just the evidential argument that remains. So there are philosophers who disagree, and I share their view that Plantinga's free will defense is not satisfactory. Um,
Right, I would agree because you could just argue you could have free will, just like without the capability of committing evil. I've heard a lot of theists make that argument that you can't have free will while not being able to commit evil. I don't see how that is true at all.
yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's a lot of issues there to be sorted out. So, for one thing, right, what Plantinga says is that um, the kind of freedom that he's interested in is what he calls morally significant freedom. And he thinks that morally significant freedom requires the capacity to do evil. So you might say, if I just had the choice between two different good things, I wouldn't be morally significantly free. At least that's what he wants to say. Um, that if I'm really morally significantly free, um, I should. That freedom only is such freedom if I can like stab my neighbor in the eye, you know, or some such, right? I have to be able to do like really horrible things in order to be morally significantly free. And this is
Yeah,
supposed to be some great thing to have, right? This capacity.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what sort
It-
of
It's
planning
it's a
wants to
little
say.
bizarre. Yeah, it's a little bizarre because when you think of your like daily choices, even like some of the more significant choices in your life, they don't generally include stabbing your neighbor in the eye. Like if you had that taken away from you, that choice, probably wouldn't care, but you'd care more about like, what job you can choose, who you like what relationships you can have, like things like that. Rather than, being able to stab your neighbor, right? So it's a little bizarre.
Yeah, and I think what's especially bizarre, and perhaps more importantly, sort of problematic for the account, is that it doesn't seem like God has that kind of freedom on planning his view, right? God is perfectly good being and can't, um, in virtue of being perfectly good, right? He's constructed in such a way that he's incapable of performing any evil action, right?
Right. Yeah, that is a little strange that like the all-powerful being is incapable of, that sort of freedom, but then he gave us that sort of freedom. It's a little strange.
Yeah, and particularly since the type of view that Plantinga has of God, which is could be called perfect being theology, um, wants to assert that all the um, that God is sort of all the possibly well, I might not be stating this precisely correctly, but the basic idea would be something like that. Be, what it means for God to be a perfect being is something like that he instantiates all perfections. Uh, which is to say all good things to the greatest possible extent, or something like that, right? Um, and so, if free will is a good, then on his view, it seems like it's a good that God should possess, right? So I don't really
Right.
understand. I'm not. Let me just say straight off the bat, I'm not an expert on planning his view. So if you're interested in how Plantinga tries to attack the argument, you may want to talk to somebody who's better informed than I am about it. But from having debated this quite a bit, uh, for I don't know, at least 20 years probably, um, I've never encountered uh, anything from people sort of invoking Plantinga's free will defense or um, anything that I've read about it that I thought could make sense of those kinds of problems. Like why would we care? Why would we think morally significant freedom was such a significant thing if God doesn't even have it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes I've heard people say something like, "Well, I don't know." They talk a little bit about having the freedom to choose God. Um, uh, And so that's not something that God needs to have, but that's something that creatures need to have the freedom to choose to accept God's love or something like that, right? It would be meaningless if um, we were somehow coerced. But I mean, there's going to be. I don't think this is going to get around the more fundamental issues that figure into the um, logical problem of evil, as I understand the argument. But even leaving that aside, um, the um, freedom to choose to love God is it's a very bizarre, to my mind, a very bizarre notion of freedom that Plantinga has in mind, which is um, called usually called libertarian free will, right? Which is not an unpopular view among philosophers of action, although interestingly, my impression is that it's generally theists who defend it, and there are a small minority of philosophers. But it's definitely in philosophy of action. It's generally considered a kind of live option. But I basically think, I mean, I can charitably say that I think there might be something that libertarian free will accounts are tracking or sort of trying to get at that are left out of most other accounts, which give it some good motivations. I could charitably say that, but I basically think the view is kind of like a nonsensical view, um, and that the fact that it's a live option and generally considered, it's generally sort of taken seriously as a live option in philosophy of action. Sorry about the street noise here. I don't share the view of philosophers who take it seriously myself. Right? I think it's kind of just a completely untenable view of like the nature of human agency. So that's another issue.
Okay. And did you want to talk about what is it? The practical issue with the problem of evil, or what was it called? Not practical.
Uh, well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I could go into I could sort of lay out what I understand the basic two arguments to be, or how I
Okay,
would run
sure.
them.
Okay,
Maybe
sure.
that's what.
Why don't we do that? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you heard about logical problem of evil, so I can start with that, right? And
Yeah.
one way to sort of frame the argument is something like this: that uh, God is, well, he's gonna. So the the problem arises from first acknowledging that evil exists, right? So if you think there is no evil, evil is an illusion. There's only good, right? Then there's no problem of evil. But you know, in Abrahamic religions, let's say Judaism, Christianity, Islam, for example, it's usually thought most uh, people who subscribe to those religious views will affirm that evil exists. So the argument, if it's a good argument, will go through against those views, right? And it's gonna, there's gonna be other properties of God that um, uh, are going to be there are going to be other properties attributed to God that are going to generate the contradiction, and it's going to be um, basically God's omnipotence and God's moral perfection, perfect goodness, omnibenevolence, omnibeneficence. Any one of those characterizations of God's um, supreme goodness.
Yeah, I
Now,
think wisdom is also one that could actually generate a contradiction as well.
yeah, if God was perfectly wise, which he's usually,
Yeah.
probably most would affirm that. Probably almost everybody would affirm that who subscribes to those religious views. Um, so how is there a logical incompatibility there? Well, the way I like to think about it is that um, God is uh, it, God can't actually improve things by creating. So one feature of these views, these Orthodox kind of religious views in these traditions, is the idea that creation is a free gift of God. So God didn't have to create, right? He wasn't morally compelled to create, right?
Right.
Um, there are people who don't take that view, and so it's, the argument would have to be modified to deal with that. But most, I think it's generally taken to be orthodox in those traditions that God didn't have to create a world. If he had chosen not to do so, that would have been fine, right? So it can't be the case that if you have a view like that, it can't be the case that um, the creation of a world, the creation of a universe, I should say, would improve a world, right? So a world I'm taking to be sort of a broader notion. God exists at a world, or at multiple different possible worlds, or usually at all different possible worlds. He's a necessary being. So he's generally taken to be a necessary being. Again, there are dissenters, but the Orthodox view tends to be that overwhelmingly that God is some kind of necessary being who exists at all possible worlds. And so a world at which God exists without a universe is nonetheless perfect on this type of Orthodox view, because if it were imperfect, it could be improved by creating a universe. But if it could be improved, then the reasoning would ordinarily go that God would be compelled to create it, because since God is all-powerful and perfectly good in intention, he would seek to maximize good wherever possible. And so if there's room for improvement, he would be compelled to act, in which case the creation would be necessary, which would violate the idea that the creation was a free gift, right? At least
Right.
on
Yeah.
most construals, right? Because again, you should keep in mind all these issues are very complicated. So there's all kinds of different ways. There's room to, there are ways to try to resist the argument. But this is sort of like the basic kind of dialectic. So if it's the case that God can't improve the world by creating a universe, right? And which seems consistent with the idea of something like God as an infinite being who's infinite in goodness, which is another orthodox kind of characterization. If you have infinite amounts of goodness, no amount of good could actually increase the sum of goodness at that world, such as any good that would be brought about by creating the universe, right? So, on that view, God can't improve things by creating, right? And so creation is totally odious, totally unnecessary, right? So then how is it that we have an evil world if that kind of a God exists, right? So I take it what they have to say is something like, well, God, uh, although creation doesn't improve things, there's no obstacle to him creating a world as long as it doesn't diminish perfection, right?
Right.
So then the question would become, well, why have any evil at all, right? It just seems, at least I think it would be intuitive to most people, right? Just seems like God could create a perfectly good world, right?
Yeah.
No, evil would just be entirely unnecessary. So why would he choose to do that, right? Um, if he were perfectly good, I think to many people it will just seem straightforwardly inconsistent for there to be any evil at all, right? So I think the reply that the theist is generally going to want to make is something like, well, God can um, create a world in which there's some evil, but it can be balanced out by compensatory goods. And if it can be balanced out by compensatory goods, then um, uh, then there's really no logical bar to God actualizing such a world, which is, say, creating a universe in which there are evils, but the evils are always balanced by a good, right? Because if you could imagine that goods were somehow could balance out the evils, then whatever evils you include um, are okay because they're balanced out by compensatory goods. That's sort of the basic idea, I think. Um, so I don't think that works because um, it doesn't seem like, since they've sort of arranged things conceptually in such a way that even pure good doesn't actually increase the sum of the good, because God is taken to be infinitely good, and you don't increase the amount of goodness by adding finite goods to an infinite set of goods, something like that, right? Because they've sort of arranged things that way, it doesn't seem like uh, that there need to be compensatory goods at all, right?
Yeah, and any evil you add would just make things worse.
No, it won't make things worse because God is, as long as it's a finite, as long as the set of evils at least is finite, um, that because God is perfectly good, um, the amount of evils can't actually diminish the total sum of the good because there's an infinite, the set of things includes an infinite amount of good things, right? And so adding finite evils won't diminish the infinite goodness of the set. That's the basic idea. But see, I just take that to be a reductio of the position, right? Because then you're just sort
You cut out there for a second.
sorry, I just take that to be a reductio of the position because um, it then becomes possible for God to create countless purely evil worlds, right? Well, when I say countless, it's maybe a bit misleading, but an unthinkable number, a number of unthinkable
Right.
size of
You could have
worlds.
like billions and billions and
Yeah,
billions, so long as it's not literally infinite.
yeah. And so I just think that at that point, the theist could bite the bullet and say, yeah, that's okay, right? But I think at that point, they are just, well, I think from the standpoint of the person posing the argument, right, they're just going to seem to be talking about some other concept, which I think is going to be a problem for the view, right? In other words, our concept of the good is just not consistent with the idea of a being that could do that, right? We wouldn't, if he could and would do that. So that, like, if God, since there's nothing on this view that could constrain God from creating uh, count enormous numbers of uh, fully evil worlds, right? Worlds which lasted for unthinkable durations, causing, let's say, unthinkable amounts of suffering, right? sufferings of unthinkable intensity, right? If a being just did that and did nothing else, right, we would just say that. I think most people would just say, well, that's just not what I mean by a good being, right? That's
Yeah,
just that's
yeah.
just that's just tracking some other concept, right? So they could bite the bullet at that, but that bullet is bitten at a high cost. Maybe it's redundant to say that. That's what it means to bite a bullet. But the cost, what the cost is that the notion of good that they're invoking just becomes unintelligible to their interlocutors, right? The people that they're sort of trying to persuade, right? Because the point
Yeah.
is, they're saying, well, look, you don't want to be, let's say, a Christian because you don't think that what you see in the world is compatible with the existence of such a being, right? And so if what we're seeing in the world, that is to say, evils, exist, right? You want to say, well, the God that is described, let's say, in the Bible or by theologians just couldn't exist, right? Or alternatively, if he could exist, then that just means that when you say he's good, you're equivocating, right? You're just, well, they might not be equivocating.
You cut out there for a second.
Sorry, they might not. I'll repeat what I said. They might not be equivocating in the sense that their usage might be consistent, but when they say God is good, they're just using good to mean something totally different from what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Right?
most
I don't think
people
they
when
want to
they
say that.
yeah, yeah, like even theists, like I don't think most people when they think of like an all good being, they think of like a being that would create infinite amount of goods and then, finite but massive amounts of evil. Like that's not really a concept of an all good being that most people would hold.
Exactly. And even Plantinga himself says as much. He says that um, it would be incompatible um, for God to create uh, worlds of pure suffering. If that was what we observed, then that couldn't be the God described by Christianity, right? That being couldn't be perfectly good and all powerful. Um,
Yeah, I mean, just like it makes logical sense. Even if he could create an infinite amount of goods, just creating a finite amount of evils, I would still see that as incompatible. Even if the finite evils were pretty minor, I would still see that as incompatible. Like if a being is of perfect good, like how would he be able to create any amount of finite evil?
that's right, yeah. Now, I think there's sort of another way to um, maybe get at this. There's sort of like another way of framing the argument um, that gets to the same or a similar conclusion, right? Um, which might be to think about it kind of like this. Um, well, so uh, what evil is, as contrasted with the good, is what ought not to be done, right? And so the good is what ought to be done, um, and so evil is what ought not to be done, right? So all else equal, you should avoid doing evil and seek to do good, right? That's sort of the simple, basic kind of understanding of what good and evil are, right? I mean, again, there's going to be ways to push back and complications, but this is sort of the basic picture, right? Now, it just seems then straightforwardly that on that view, there couldn't be any evil if God was perfectly good and perfectly powerful, right? And so, again, the way that theists are typically want to push back on that is to talk about what are called necessary evils. So we might say that an evil um, is permissible um, if it leads to a greater good, right? So, the standard example is going to be something like uh, a vaccination, like if you vaccinate a child, right? Um, the uh, the the shot causes suffering to the child. Let's say that that's bad, right? So why would we cause suffering to a child? Well, because um, by doing so, we save it from death by disease, uh, and let's say suffering from it, suffering caused by diseases, right? So for a smaller amount of suffering, we could avert greater suffering, um, and we could also get, you know, life, which might be taken to be a good, as long as it's not, you know, uh, overwhelmed with suffering or something like that. Um, so people will say, yeah, so what evils we see are permitted um, because there's some greater good, um, which can't really be avoided. Um, I'm sorry, the evils can't really be avoided to bring about this greater good. That's what's meant by a necessary evil. Now, I think the issue there is, well, of course, I mean, one point you could make is, well, God is all powerful, so he doesn't need vaccinations to prevent disease, right? He can
Yeah,
just
yeah.
he can just sort of bring about a state where uh, uh, the evil is
We're
avoided altogether, right? And so
yeah,
it's not actually
yeah.
necessary, right? Now they're going to want to push back on that, uh, and so I think what we need to do is look a little bit carefully, sort of try to analyze this idea of necessary evil. And I think the idea there is that it's a notion that involves a counterfactual, which is to say, if what it means to say that an evil is necessary, because you might say, well, if the evil is necessary, then why not just call it a good, right? Since it ought to be done,
Yeah,
right? If there's
yeah.
no way around if there's no way to avert the disease, um, uh, without the vaccination, right, then why say the vaccination is an evil at all? Why not just say it's a good, right? Because it brings about a good state of affairs, right? So I think what they want to say, which I think is fine, which I would accept, right, is that yeah, well, what makes it a necessary evil rather than a necessary good or any kind of good, or at least the kind of good uh, that's unmixed with evil, right, is that it um, is that all else equal, which is to say, if there was an alternative, you ought not to have it at all. So if you could bring about the good some other way, then you ought not to have it, right? So if we could figure out a way to administer the vaccine without causing the pain of the shot, that ought to be preferred, right? Now again, that's not going to help immediately with respect to God, because again, as we say, God can bring about that state of affairs, right?
Yeah.
So, how can they draw upon this as
You just cut out.
how can they draw upon this as a way to resist the objection, right? And I think what they want to do is say, well, there are some goods that are logically uh, connected to evils, right? Um, which is to say that they can't be untangled, right? You can't have one without the other, right? So in the case of a vaccination, right, presumably there's a logically possible world such that one can be inoculated with a vaccine without any pain being administered, right? So the idea of inoculation is not logically tied to pain and suffering and so on. It just happens to be a contingent fact that we're at a world at which, at least for the present, the only way to get inoculated is through a painful shot, right? But that doesn't mean that necessarily at all worlds that connection would hold between the two events, right? But see, they're going to want to say there are some uh, events, some states of affairs that logically, which are good, that logically require an evil in order for them to exist at all, right? And one example of this would be the idea of redemption. There can't be redemption without a fall, right?
Right.
So they want to say redemption is a good, and the only way to bring it about is to permit an evil, a fall, but that's an evil which can be justified because there's no other way to bring about that outcome, right? And so it becomes a permissible evil, right? So permissible evil is not some kind of contradiction on this field.
That's yeah. I still see that as like a weird explanation because I mean, you don't have to have redemption. You
Yeah,
know.
so I certainly think
Yeah.
that's an issue. I certainly think that's a problem that they don't have a good answer to. But I don't even think this is going to work. So one way to think about it is that you might object. Sorry, one way to think about it is that you might object that that if in fact the connection is a logical one, then there's no actual counterfactual such that the evil could ever be done without, right? Because the way I had framed it was that previously was that uh, a necessary evil is one which, all else equal, you would dispense with, right? Um, uh, which is to say, if you could bring about the good without it, right, then we could legitimately call it an evil rather than a good, right?
Yeah.
If you should do without it in those cases where you can, right? But you see, in the case of redemption, since there is no counterfactual world where you can have redemption without a fall, then it just seems like it doesn't make sense to say that there's any way to say that it ought not be done, because in every possible world it ought be done, right? Unlike in the vaccination case, right, where if you want to bring about protection from disease, there could be worlds where you don't need to administer a painful shot, right? In the case of redemption, there is no world where if your aim is to bring about redemption, you can do so without a fall. So one could object that a fall is uh, always something that ought to be done, right? Because it brings about redemption, right? So, in fact, it doesn't make sense to call it an evil at all, right? Now, I think the way they're going to want to respond here is to say something like, well, what actually makes it an evil rather than just simply a good, even though it ought to be done, right? So it's an evil that's permissible, right? Is that you can have a fall without a redemption. So it is true that a redemption requires a fall, but a fall doesn't require a redemption. And so a fall in itself will be bad, right? But it will be uh, it will be a bad that's permissible in the cases where it brings about a redemption, right? Where it's necessary for a redemption, right?
Right, and you can find plenty of circumstances where there was a fall and no redemption, a la Hitler or something.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, I mean, they're going to probably want to contest. Yeah, so that's where you get into the evidential arguments, which is like, well, is it actually like this, right? The world that we see. But leaving that aside, right? Because what they're going to want to do is say something like, well, as long as there's some redemption, then um, uh, then it's logically possible, right, for the evil to exist, um, even though um, it is an evil, right? Because it can be compensated for by good, right? But see, I think there's going to be a number of problems with that view. Because for one thing, if you take God to be a necessary being, then at every world which he exists, um, at every world at which he exists, he's going, which is to say every world, right? Because a necessary being exists at all possible worlds. Um, it's going to be the case that,
You cut out for a second there.
sorry, the push talk button got stuck. It's going to be the case that um, God is going to be compelled to balance the fall with a redemption, right? And so it's not actually the case that there's any possible world uh, at which um, that fall is evil, right? Because since God exists at every possible world, right? So in other words, for it to be an evil, it requires a world at which uh, it exists and is not compensated, right? So when we say it's a necessary evil, right, the counterfactual analysis requires that there's some possible world where you could have it without having the compensatory good. And in those cases, it would.
Cut out again there.
Sorry. So it has to be balanced out. The evil has to be balanced out in some possible world. Sorry, there's going to be some possible world where the evil is not balanced out by some compensatory good, right? And in those worlds, it will be evil simplicator. So what makes it a necessary evil is that at some worlds that evil can be balanced out by a compensatory good, let's say redemption, right? But uh, but the thing is, since God exists at every possible world, then he's compelled at every world where he permits that so-called evil to have a compensatory good, right? In this case, redemption, right, to balance it out, then that just means it can't actually be construed as an evil, because for it to be construed as an evil, of the permissible kind, right? It has to be that there's some counterfactual world where you could have it without the compensating good. But there is no such world if God exists and is perfectly good and perfectly powerful at every possible world, right? In which case, he
Right.
always ought to. He always ought to cause the fall, right? There's nothing evil about it on that analysis, right?
Right. And that ends up being like a weird situation for theists because then they'd have to say like, okay, well, no murder is like wrong because okay, well, we need that to have some sort of redemption.
Exactly. The point
Yeah.
is they want to affirm the existence of evil, but this analysis um, contradicts uh, the view that anything that God permits can be called evil, because it just seems to follow that if God permits it, it's a good.
Yeah, and like you can get into really, really weird territory. Like you could say, okay, well, if Hitler were to survive, like, didn't kill himself, and then ended up, I don't know, saving even more people than he ended up killing, you could say, okay, well, that was redemption. Therefore, like him, murdering 10 million people was good. I don't think anybody would say that's a good or that ended up, justifying the redemption.
Yeah,
Or the
the whole
redemption justifying the evil.
yeah the whole idea of evil being permissible as consistent with God's moral perfection and His omnipotence, um, on this strategy of saying that the goods are reasonably outweighed, sorry, that the evils are reasonably outweighed by goods, right, turns on the idea that it's even a coherent notion to say that there can be necessary evils, right? But if this analysis is correct, then if God exists and He's all powerful, um, uh, and He's all good, right? If those are taken to be essential properties of God, right, then there just cannot be any evil, and these things are mislabeled. Now that's going to contradict with Orthodox theology, right? Because they affirm that evils do exist. But if this analysis is correct, it just doesn't seem like that makes any sense, right?
Yeah, they'd basically have to bite the bullet and say evil doesn't exist.
Right, right, and
Which,
that's just going to mean that the problem of evil argument uh, doesn't doesn't go through. But the whole point is that the argument is targeted at theological positions that affirm the existence of evil in worlds where
yeah,
all powerful, all good deities exist, right?
yeah, and pretty much every religion, every Abrahamic religion certainly acknowledges the existence of evil.
Yeah, it's going to be an unusual theology that is going to bite that bullet. Right. But I
Yeah,
think I think either way, it's not going to matter, given the sort of first way I framed the problem, which is that God can't actually increase the sum of the good because He's infinitely good, and therefore, um, it's the idea of compensatory goods doesn't really seem to make any sense at all because they're completely unnecessary, since that view of God is just going to be compatible with perfectly evil worlds of countless size, in number, duration in existence, and, well, I shouldn't say countless, but unthinkably
yeah,
large numbers, unthinkably uh, long lasting, and unthinkably intense in the degree of
yeah. So
suffering.
long as it's not infinite, like his infinite good, then any evil he commits would be justified, no matter the magnitude or duration. Which is kind of a ridiculous position to hold.
Exactly.
All right, does that cover all of your stuff on
Well, I mean that
the
covers
philosophical
the
problem
that
of
covers.
evil?
Sorry, yeah, that that covers the basic structure. I mean, again, as I say, the thing that way philosophy works is that there's kind of like always room to push back, right? Because
Yeah,
all of
yeah,
these things, rest on sort of complicated analyses for every um, part of the conceptual apparatus, right? Every concept, right? Omnipotence, God, freedom, evil, so on, right? All these things are complicated, require complicated analysis to um, to give an account of. And given that those analyses are complicated, um, the theist can always sort of say, well, the analysis you've given doesn't capture the view that I'm proposing. And so they'll offer some analysis that has some modification, and they can often try to resist the argument in those ways, right? But just sort of leaving aside all those issues, I think that's sort of like the basic outline of the logical problem.
okay. And did you want to move on to the evidential problem of evil?
Yeah. Let me just. My battery is going to die, so I need to switch to a different headset so I can plug in my backup battery. So just give
Sure.
me 1 second to do that.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so I think the sound is probably not quite as good on this headset, but if it's okay, we
It's
can
pretty
continue.
terrible.
Is it pretty terrible? All right, because
Yeah,
see,
it's really bad.
in that case, we might want to pick up and do the evidential argument at a different
Sure.
time because
Um,
I don't think I can. I can't count on this other way of plugging in the battery to like consistently. I've had a lot of problems using a mic with this. I have this kind of like splitter cable where I
yeah.
can plug in the same headset, but it hasn't been working lately. So we might want to just arrange another
Yeah,
session.
sure. Let's just do that. We'll just leave it at the philosophical issue with evil, and then we'll go on to the evidential problem of evil.
Yeah, that's fine. And I mean, in the interim, some people may offer some good criticisms of stuff I said in this session, and so maybe I
Yeah,
can try to address those in the
yeah,
next.
sure. Okay,
Okay.
yeah, that'd be great.
All right. So
Okay,
we'll figure
thanks for
that
coming
out.
on, man.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, take care.
All right. See you later.
Okie dokie. Let me see if there's any questions that were left here. Oh, wait. That was the wrong one. There we go.
God doesn't exist. Explain hentai. Checkmate atheist.
God damn it. That was double audio. Yeah, if God doesn't exist, explain hentai. That's a tough one. I think it is entirely possible that, hentai does not make up for, all of the evils in the world, like, the Holocaust. That is a possibility. I'd be fully willing to debate that issue. Thanks for the donation, Bibs Cartel. Dodo donated $2. He says, "You have to see this. It's awesome." Is it a stupid fucking... Yeah, it's an orangutan. Okay, great. Yep, you've been very interested in orangutans lately, Dodo. I've noticed. But thanks for the donation, dude. If anybody has any other questions, just ask right now. Or forever hold your pee-pee poo-poo. Good is subjective, evil is subjective. You could make that argument. Well, I hold that opinion. The issue is you like theists. They believe that good is objective, evil is objective. So within their own logical framework, there is a problem with evil. Within their own logical framework, it would be impossible for evil to exist if an all-powerful, benevolent God exists. Even within the view that good is subjective, evil is subjective, like, even in that scenario where, say, God had his own subjective beliefs on good or evil, I think that would still probably create a problem, because if they're going to claim that their God has a certain set of rules, like, thou shalt not kill, rape is bad, things like that, even if God took that to be, subjective, then he's still allowing for this to happen. So within God's own moral framework, even if it were subjective, then I don't see how you could say, like, I don't see how there's any logical way for, I don't know, murder to exist or rape to exist. If supposedly these gods in the Bible or the Quran are against it and they have the problem to stop it. So I still see that creating a logical problem, even if you're going to take the stance that God exists, it's just that morality is subjective. If you don't think God exists, then clearly you haven't read the Bible. Oh my god. There's people who read the Bible and then realize how fucking stupid and ridiculous the book is and then turn atheist. That happened to Matt Dillahunty. There was a Christian guy who was reading the Bible to deaf people. Or not, yeah, no, I think it was blind people. Can't remember what it was. No, he would do, it was for deaf people. He'd do sermons for deaf people and speak in sign language. And then after reading the Bible more carefully, he ended up going atheist. Like, there being a lot of cases where that's happened to people. So no, Bible is actually a book where if you're a relatively intelligent, reasonable person, if you read it, you're more likely to become atheist. Debate with Darth Dawkins when, I don't know, dude, I don't really give a shit about that person. Is Healthline a credible site? I'm not sure. Haven't really taken a look at it. Did you work out today? Nope. I was in bed for quite a few hours with really bad stomach pain. Didn't end up working out. Might end up working out after the stream. I don't know. We'll have to see. Alright, well, hope you guys enjoyed the stream. It's going to stay up, so this just covers the philosophical problem of evil. Next stream I do with Jack Angstreich. It'll be the evidential problem of evil. So thanks to the two people who donated in Streamlabs, Vibs Cartel, and Dodo. And as always, keep making those atheist gains. Oh, Dodo donated $2. You should show us the orangutan clip, the story behind the father and daughter, amazing. No, I'm not going to do that, Dodo. I don't see that's relevant to the problem of evil, but thanks for the donation anyway, and good night, everybody.